All right, well, welcome everybody. Hopefully you can hear me on the microphone. We'll kind of get the meeting kicked off here. I want to thank everybody, I can see we have a bunch of residents that both Aaron and I have talked to, perhaps some people we haven't talked to. We have some trustees, former trustees, Infrastructure Commission members, so thanks for everyone for coming out tonight. Tonight, basically what Aaron and I are here is basically to hold a question and answer session that people have just regarding our water distribution system, our water production system, and this is truly going to be a Q&A. So format-wise tonight, because we have a fairly good number of people here, we ask that you kind of put your questions written down in the back. That way we can kind of keep a good flow going. If you have additional questions that pop up through the meeting, feel free to have a basket up front and in back. You can drop those in and we'll keep reading through those. But we don't really have we're not going to lecture to you tonight with any sort of presentation. This is truly a Q&A. We have a few slides that we have for reference to point to some things for some common questions that we have, but we're here basically just to answer your questions. And with that, we'll basically kind of kick off just kind of going through some of the cards that we have submitted so far. So also just as so many of you are aware, we are recording this tonight. It's one of also the reasons why we're doing these questions, so we don't have to wrestle with mics out in the audience. Aaron and I will basically just read the questions, we'll answer them, and then we'll have a video available probably early next week up on the website for everything we went over tonight.
Okay. Do you want me to read the first one?
You can read the first question.
Okay, the first one's for you. Did you vet the RO system before it was installed? Did anyone foresee problems ahead of time, as is possible with any new system or installation? And what will you do in the future?
Okay. So the RO system was vetted. There was a couple different processes that went through that. The water study group back through the mid-2000s did do an analysis kind of on all that. We actually had a pilot program that was conducted right around 2007, 2008, the exact date I don't recall offhand, but there was a pilot program that we conducted with a company called Carrillo, and it might have been with Baxter Woodin as well. After we did that pilot program, then we kind of went to the full design, where we kind of then solicited proposals from multiple engineering firms. The firm we selected was ultimately a company called CDM Smith, and then we worked with a company called J.J. Henderson to do the renovation of the plants. What was the second part of that question?
What will you do in the future?
So I guess the question is in terms of the RO system. So the RO system, I mean, is fairly established at this point in terms of the RO skids that we have in the facility. Future, in terms of maintenance or capacity, we have kind of standard maintenance that we're going to be seeing here coming up in the next few years. That's going to be the replacement of the actual membranes in the RO system. Those typically have a lifespan of about 8 years or so, and our system came online really in 2012. The rest of the plant was completed at the end of 2013. So we're going to be seeing it's going to be a routine maintenance process to replace those membranes. We may have other sort of scheduled maintenance going on. Other sorts of things that might be coming down the pipeline. If you saw the presentation that we did back in into June, kind of giving a system overview to the new village board members, you might have seen that we talked a little bit about a possible new well, as well as some treatment feasibility for well number 1. Future items related to that, we're doing some engineering studies on both components related to that. Well number 1, we're looking at, is it feasible to do any sort of mobile treatments or emergency treatment of well number 1? We worked with a company called Water Surplus out of Loves Park to look at the feasibility of that, and it is feasible under certain scenarios and under certain circumstances. And we're kind of continuing. Baxter & Woodman, the engineering company we're working with right now, is doing a study right now to determine what sort of modifications might be required at the water treatment plant to bring that partially treated water in through what we call the pipe gallery, and then bring it into the reservoir before out the distribution. So that work is expected to be completed probably the end of this summer, and we'll be bringing it back to the Infrastructure Commission, Public Works and Water Committee to review that. The other kind of component with that, which I kind of mentioned a little bit before, is the possible well number 5. We did complete a IEPA, what's known as a project development report, about a year ago, or about 6 or 8 months ago, and identifies potential water improvement projects throughout the distribution system, including water main, our towers, and potentially a well number 5. There's engineering that needs to be done on that. We haven't done any engineering to a great extent on that. Basically, we have to do what's we call preliminary or phase 1 engineering to determine the feasibility of the location. So that work will be getting started here probably in the next several months here. The village board's going to be reviewing that. Actually, We discussed it at the last board meeting, and it'll be on the board agenda for the next one coming up. Then the first component of that will be what's called a well interference test. And the well interference test will essentially look at the location that's recommended in Field Park to determine, does that Field Park location potentially impact the capabilities or capacities of well number 3 or well number 4? Because we don't want to build a new well and potentially impact those based on proximity. So that's the first component of that. And then if we do continue forward with that, we'll be getting into the design engineering and other sort of conversations. So it was a very long answer for what else we got?
Okay. Does the village envision an increase in water rates if progress moves forward with plans for well number 1 or well number 5?
So at this point, at least of what we've discussed, discussions I've been involved in, and that we've discussed at the Public Works and Water Committee and the Infrastructure Commission level, I'm not aware of any increases proposed as part of what we have in our project development report for the IEPA loan. That may change in the future, and the Finance Committee would probably review that with the Finance Department, but I've not been involved in any conversations that involve that thus far. The project development report does identify a number of projects, probably in the next 5 to 7 years, for overall system improvements. Those projects primarily are water distribution, which is water main replacement, which would go hand in hand with roadway improvements. We have to do some rehabilitation on both of our storage facilities in town, which are the elevated tank at Spring Rock Park and the standpipe near Lyons Township High School. And then, again, we also identified in there, but it's not a confirmed project per se yet, is the well number 5. Okay?
All right. This is a 2-part question.
Okay.
What measures are being implemented to address ongoing water discoloration? And the recent water test in my home in Ridgewood indicated water hardness of the highest levels. What is being done to soften the water?
Okay. So the first one, so I can reference this.
Yes.
So the ongoing water discoloration. This is primarily, and I'm making a little bit of an assumption here, that this discolorization is been as a result of the recent issues we've had both this year and back in 2015 from issues with the well. If that's the case, I'll kind of address that first, and then I'll talk a little bit about if it's another issue, and that is if specifically, they've kind of mentioned Ridgewood here. So the first kind of issue is, why did we have this discoloration from these two most recent scenarios with the well? The main cause of that is because, based on the time of the year that those incidents occurred, we had to run well number 1, which is a shallow well, directly to distribution. Now, the village has 3, actually, I do have a slide on this one. Our system overview, this is basically, we have 3 wells that you can see right now. We have well number 1, which is located on the south side of Burlington and Wolf Road. Well number 3 located right here at Village Hall, and then well number 4 down by the Public Works Garage. So well number 3 and 4 are the village's 2 deep wells, and they are the primary wells that we use for all of our water into the distribution. Well number 1 is basically an emergency well, which we do not wish to run under most circumstances. Depending on the time of the year, and if we have another well offline, we do have to run it on occasion to supplement to meet demand. Both of the most recent incidents back in roughly September 2015 and this one in April, you're getting into that early and late summer months when demand is increasing. So we did unfortunately have to run well number 1 to distribution. Fortunately, well number 1, for a number of different reasons, cannot go through the current RO plant. Based on just the size of the facility, we only have 2 RO trains. We can only get 2 in there. The output of that well, it doesn't output as much water to get the pressures to put it through plant. And also just the nature of that water is very hard on those membrane systems. So that well is kind of truly an emergency well, but it is very high in iron, which you all probably experienced over these past couple months. And that's really the discoloration issue that most people are experiencing. Ultimately, our goal to relieve the discoloration issues is we don't ever want to put well number 1 back into distribution, at least not without any sort of treatment options. And that's what kind of goes back to what I mentioned before, is where we're looking at this either temporary well number 1 treatment solution for those certain periods when we're doing maintenance or when we have equipment offline that we can temporarily treat that, or if we have an alternative well, another deep well, we can not have to put well number 1 back into distribution. Most likely, we would probably abandon that well and cap it. So in terms of the long term then, in terms of well number 1 usage, really any sort of discoloration related to well number 1 should dissipate. Haven't had well number 1 back to distribution in probably
since June 2nd.
Since June 2nd. We were running 3 chlorinated but not softened up until about a week, 10 days ago, where now everything is going back through the RO plant and being softened. There may be some minor lingering issues, especially because we have some of that iron deposited. It's compounded by the fact that we were supposed to do hydrant flushing this past spring. We weren't able to do that because of this well issue, so there's going to be some sediment buildup in the pipes that we need to address. We're looking internally whether we're going to do hydrant flushing this fall. We don't know yet if we're going to be doing hydrant flushing this fall or if we're going to wait till next spring. At this point, because we're still just kind of getting through the issue with the well, we don't really want to create another scenario, because hydrant flushing is going to cause sediment stir-up. That's kind of the nature of what it does to get it flushed out. We don't really want to have to cause that again if there's no need to do that. So we're going to kind of evaluate that over the next month or two and then determine if we want to do flushing this fall or just do it for next spring. Water testing in your home for Ridgewood. So Ridgewood water quality is a unique beast unto itself for a couple different reasons, primarily for Ridgewood. In our water distribution system, this is a quick map that kind of shows all the pipes in town. If you recall from the map I just showed you previously, you can see that our production facilities and our distribution facilities are all kind of centered or in the north center part of the community. Ridgewood is on almost the farthest tip of the community and is the farthest subdivision that's on the village's main system. So there's a couple kind of issues that make the matters worse for Ridgewood. It's just far away from our existing storage facilities, so the water ages as it gets to there. And as the water has more exposure time, some of the chlorine residuals, some of the other chemistry just kind of changes, and that's natural as it's getting to that section of town. The other big issue with Ridgewood specifically is the way it's just the subdivision's laid out. Because of the cul-de-sacs, you have dead ends in the pipe where you don't have dead ends in any other section of the town. So because of those dead ends, and you can see those specifically on the east side down here, southeast side, this down corner down by Ridge and Oak tends to have some stale water problems, and there's a couple other cul-de-sacs up here as well. When you don't get good turnover from water, either from interconnects that allow it to flow or just usage during the day, the water just sits in the pipes and it gets kind of stale. So that creates problems with that as well. We did ice pigging, which is a flushing mechanism, about 2 years ago in Ridgewood as an experiment. Essentially what the ice pigging program was is we injected ice into the pipe and had a consistency basically of a Slurpee. And that would help to scour those pipes out and get the iron and other sort of buildup out of there. And we have the report on the village website if you want to look at it. The stuff that came out of there, it got a lot of stuff out of the pipes. Now, whether it did any sort of long-term help on that or not, it's tough to say. It did in the immediate period, definitely did help. Long-term, I think a lot of it might come down to just this overall system, the age of the pipes there and so forth. The Ridgewood subdivision particularly too does have just bad pipe in the ground. Specifically Ridgewood Drive, we have a lot of water main breaks on. It's just brittle pipe for what it is. We have, let's see where I have it. Yeah, so here is a quick map, and it might be a little bit hard to see in this view, but this is a hotspot analysis of basically where we have some water main breaks in town over a 5-year period. This main hotspot that you see up in the center of town, this is the distribution main from well number 4 to the water plant. That one was primarily, as we were going through the reconstruction process of the RO plant back in 11 and 12, it was a transition from a manual to automatic process, and we had to adjust to that. And there were some breaks on that main line because the well was not able to respond quickly enough based on its distance to what the water plant was telling it to do. The other 2 hotspots you'll see, there's a hotspot section here in Springdale, and then the other big one right down here on the bottom towards Ridgewood Drive. This is just a bad section of pipe, and ultimately we do need to probably replace that pipe. The village completed a Ridgewood infrastructure plan in 2015 that looked at the water main, the roads, sewer in that section of town, and identified some project improvement costs for that area. Those costs are significant, as any sort of infrastructure costs are out there. I don't have any time frames for any sort of projects in Ridgewood at this point, but we have done some work to kind of identify what those problems are. What else next?
What is the total amount the new $5 infrastructure fee will generate?
That I don't know the answer to. Anybody in the back know the answer to that one?
Approximately $135,000 a year.
Okay, so the answer was approximately $135,000 a year.
What was that for again?
There's a capital improvement fee or infrastructure fee that's going to be added to the water bills. And what that will do is that is going to be identified specifically for capital improvements. It's specifically for capital improvements. So the water rate pays for basically the production and operation of our facilities, and this fee is identified to help cover some of those capital improvement costs that I kind of mentioned before through the IEPA loan and some of these other stuff, which actually are referenced on this page. On this page here that you guys see before you, there's a number of the water mains that we've identified as high priority projects. These are high priority projects based on essentially two factors. One, either the main breaks that are adjacent to them if you have a high amount of water main breaks, or two, they're 4-inch pipe. 4-inch water main is one of our high priorities for replacement simply because of fire protection needs. Our standard now for installation is typically 8-inch pipe. Some pipe that was installed in the 1980s was maybe 6-inch pipe. But the 4-inch pipe is really stuff we want to target. As we kind of develop some of our project plans for replacement for capital, we line that stuff up with our road improvement program. All this pipe is underneath the road, so in order to do any sort of replacement of water and sewer projects, that has to work in conjunction with the roadway replacement program as well.
So that's the second question. Are you working with the road construction department to be sure our old water mains are replaced at the time of new road construction so that the new referendum money approved is not wasted?
The answer is yes, because I am the road department as well. So yeah, this talks a little bit about that. So what you see kind of on this graph here, on the left is a clear picture from that previous one of the 4-inch water main that's in town. On the right-hand side is the road inventory that we have in the village. So every year as part of our road program, the village, my staff, myself, we actually drive throughout the entire town and we give a rating to each section, block by block of road in town. And that gets a numerical rating based on its condition. And there's a chart in there that gives it that numerical rating. The sections that you see that are identified as red in here are the streets that are identified as in poor condition. So when we develop our programs, then we do look at all these road PCI ratings and then line those up with potential water main or sewer projects as well to get some synergy out of those. One thing I'll just kind of note too is that the water and sewer fund that pays for water main also pays for sewer. We have a combined fund, so any sort of sewer improvements that the village needs to do, whether it's sewer separation, sewer replacement, reconstruction of outfalls, things like that, all comes out of the same pot of money. So it gives you a little bit of perspective kind of where that costs are. This sheet here gives you a little bit of idea of some of the sewer projects we have going on. I identified here from that Ridgewood infrastructure report some of the sewer improvements they've identified down here. And then there's also, as part of the village's NPDES permit, up in the north side of town, specifically the Old Town area, potential separation of the combined sewer to separate storm sewers. And I'm just putting this on here really to give some perspective, because you can see there are tens of millions of dollars worth of improvements that need to be done here. And this is not to say that these are all necessarily high priority that need to be done now in the next 5 years or something, but you know, this is again a pot of money that's shared between these funds of projects that need to be prioritized, and the village doesn't have $26 million to do all this work. So it is a process that we evaluate over time and phase these projects in based on their need.
Is this file available on the village website, what you're showing us?
I'm not sure if this specific page is. All the roadway documentation is on the website, as well as the Ridgewood infrastructure report is on there.
Why is the water so often yellow and causing rings around the drain?
Okay, so again, I'm kind of assuming that this is to the recent issues. This would be the well number 1 problem that we've had. Overall water quality, I'll talk a little bit about that here. Let's see. Where did I put that one? Here we go. So overall, kind of water quality. There's
During normal operation.
during normal operations. Yes, this is during normal operations when the plant is softening all the water. So I've talked a little bit already about the issues we have with well number one and having to bring that to distribution. During normal operations, our plant output is very good water. You can see here, this is a chart of sampling that we did in 2016. The kind of key ones I highlighted a little bit here are the hardness, which you can see highlighted on the left in red, and the total iron. And we have it broken down by each subdivision. And as a comparison, we have Timber Trails on here. Now, for those who don't know, Timber Trails, since it was prior to being annexed by the village, was part of the LaGrange Highlands Sanitary District as a golf course. It remained as part of that, and therefore they get their water from the LaGrange Highlands. That water is Lake Michigan water. So just give you a comparison, our hardness levels and our iron levels are very competitive. In fact, you actually see our hardness levels in most cases are actually below the Timber Trails hardness levels. Now, that's not to say that we don't have issues in the distribution system. I talked a little bit about some of the specific issues that the Ridgewood subdivision has. Those issues kind of get exacerbated based on the age and the configuration of the pipe out there. There are some other sections of town also, specifically the northern part of Springdale, because of its proximity to the elevated tank, when there are issues in the distribution system, specifically water main breaks and things like that, it has a propensity to actually change direction of flow in the pipe. The way our distribution system is set up is the pipe is not unidirectional. It's a giant spider web, and the flow will equalize throughout the entire distribution system. So when you do have scenarios where the pipe flow changes, that causes some of that sediment to get stirred up and can create some water quality issues.
It seems to me that infrastructure issues like the poor condition of our water system should be addressed before roads are repaved. Why did we have a referendum on roads first?
So the referendum for the roadway fund was specifically because there's no hard identified fund specifically for a road with its own funding mechanism. As I kind of mentioned before, with the water and sewer infrastructure, we have a water and sewer fund that has a defined funding mechanism that comes in. Really, the reason why we need to find these funding sources is because capital is prohibitively expensive. You're looking at several $100,000 per block to reconstruct a road, and the same sort of dollar amount for water infrastructure. Tied into that, though, all that infrastructure is underneath the roads. So you can't replace the water main or the sewer without doing the road as well. So all that stuff does need to happen hand in hand. The roadway referendum is kind of a separate funding mechanism to address the roads. And the reason why that is separate too is not all roads, or not all of the roads need water or sewer replacement on them. The construction projects we're doing this year, for example, the water main is newer. We don't actually need to do water main replacement on those sections of town. So that's why that funding is separate.
Why does the water have a blue or greenish tint periodically?
So I have not heard any specific. I know there was somebody at a Public Works and Water Committee about a month or two ago that asked about that. Most likely, what I would guess is that is a patina coming off of copper. Usually what happens whenever you get sort of patina like that, there's some sort of exposure to oxygen or air. So there may be some sort of air infiltration coming into your copper line somewhere, allowing that patina to occur. And if that's coming out of your faucet, you can give us a call. Someone from Aaron's staff or from my Public Works crews can come out and help you kind of track that down if it's something inside your house.
Causes of sediment in the water.
Do you want to take that one?
Sure.
Okay.
So, like Matt has said throughout this presentation, there are various things that can cause sediment in the water. One of them can be if we have to use well 1 to supplement in emergencies. Well 1 has a higher iron content, so we can't necessarily blend all of that out. Another cause, for example, just happened yesterday when they had to open a hydrant and do some flow testing, and it actually ended up changing the flow in the pipes, and that stirred up sediment. So there are various issues in distribution that can cause the sediment to build up.
And I'll also expand upon a little bit. There's a phenomenon known as tuberculation that occurs in water main pipes. tuberculation, so even with our treatments, softening treatment, this was prior with the lime softening plant as well, you're still going to have mineralization that occurs in your water. And you actually want that mineralization. Magnesium, sodium, calcium, that sort of stuff. And that stuff is going to precipitate out over time. One of the things that causes that precipitate out is the actual chlorine that we add to the water for disinfectant. Oxidizes it out. That mineralization just over the age of the pipe is going to collect on the inside of that pipe, and that's what's known as tuberculation. Most of the time it's not a problem, it's not a health issue at all, but that tuberculation can be disturbed or be shaken loose for, when we have changes in flow. And it really is kind of a factor that kind of comes down to the age of the pipe. When you have a lot older pipe, you just have more exposure time that you're going to have that tuberculation build up. There are a couple instances with the tuberculation, specifically iron, and we have a little bit of this again in the Ridgewood subdivision because you don't have a lot of flow in the pipe in some areas, where you get this sulfur-reducing bacteria that kind of feeds upon that iron. Now, it's not a health issue, but the sulfur-reducing bacteria produces a sulfur byproduct, which for some people can cause kind of a rotten egg smell. That was one of the primary reasons why we did the ice pigging, is to try to scour some of that out. There are options to try to pull some of that tuberculation out of the pipe. Pigging, which is a process of basically scouring the pipe, is one of those. That is expensive and it is very invasive. In order to do traditional or mechanical pigging, where they actually put a giant metal mechanism in the pipe and push it through, you have to shut down that main, you have to cut open the street to be able to inject it in there. The ice pigging was an experiment we did, and it was, I would say, moderately successful in being able to be less invasive, but also try to scour some of that pipe out. We're pretty confident that it didn't completely scour out to the same degree that mechanical pig would have, but we did see a lot of debris coming out of the pipe. Really, the only kind of long-term solution to kind of get, if you have a tuberculation problem or any sort of issue with that, is you got to either line the pipe or replace the pipe that's in the ground there.
I know your reasons for not going with Lake Michigan Water in the past: control of water supply and cost. Why can't the village go back and look at the reasons again? We have had rate increases, water bans, and water quality issues.
Sure. I would say primary reason why we're not looking at lake water now is because lake water would not be the solution to the problems we're experiencing. So let's take a look at the actual problems we have. There's two major causes of the problem. And I think the water quality data we have, and it's all on the website, proves out that the RO plant is not a water quality problem. The RO plant actually puts out very good quality water. Our two main problems are having to run well number one to distribution, not through the RO plant, and the age of our distribution system, which is causing issues with the water main breaks, where we had significant numbers of water main breaks over the past several years. Those have come down recently, and various issues in terms of water quality. All of those issues, none of those issues would be solved by changing to lake water from the RO plant. There's a number of other things too, just the way our system is currently set up, trying to bring, and these would also still hold true to the Water Study Group's initial report, is, we're centered around the center of our town, where our water treatment plant, our facilities are. You'd have to bring your water pipe from another community to that. It's not as simple as just tapping into LaGrange. There's only certain communities within the vicinity that are actually allowed to resell water, so you'd have to look at that. So kind of based on those reasons is really why lake water is not the solution to the problems we have. Really, we have to focus on, making sure well number one doesn't go back to distribution system. And second then we have to, which we have identified through the REPA loan process and our project development report, improvements to our water system overall. And just to kind of reiterate, and some of you I've probably talked to this about, is kind of just the age of our distribution system. So Western Springs is an old community, and in a large percentage of that community, we have the original water main still in the ground, and the sewer as well. We have 52 miles of main. About 46% of that was built prior to 1937. Everything you see in red on this chart is main that's about 90 years old. So that stuff is just beginning to reach the end of its life. And unfortunately, we're the generation that has to kind of deal with that. A lot of that's been talked about, and this is not an issue that just Western Springs is dealing with. The American Water Works Association has been dealing with this. This is across the country. They put out a report back in 2001 called the Dawn of Replacement Era, and they followed it up in 2012. And these are PDFs you guys can find if you just Google them. called Buried No Longer, where it talks about the huge impact of infrastructure that the village, or not just the United States in general, has to replace. And it is going to be a big cost. Most of the water main and most of the infrastructure in most towns when it was constructed initially was done through a special assessment as the construction of that subdivision. And it was those original residents who came in when they bought their homes for the first time, they were paying for that infrastructure to be installed. We don't have any plans at this point to do anything like that, but that's how that infrastructure was originally installed, and now we have to kind of deal with the scope of replacing that over the next time. The key findings from the AWW here, and I won't go through all this, but it basically identifies that the United States as a whole has a lot of work to do. And you guys have probably heard this on the news. You know, the American Society of Civil Engineering gives America's infrastructure a D- rating. You've heard the stories about our bridges and so forth. So I'm not going to belabor that too much, but we do have old infrastructure in our town. Most of our pipe is old. Our 2 storage facilities are built in the 1960s and earlier, and it's time that we need to kind of address some of those.
Pastime.
Pastime, yes.
I guess I'm from an older generation where I thought our property taxes were, a lot of that money was used to fund infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
But nowadays the thought is that's just tax money. We have to have something else to pay for new infrastructure.
Sure.
Because evidently things weren't done when they should have been done on a regular, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there should have been an infrastructure schedule every so many years.
Well,
If we got this bad.
there is that. I mean, the tough part is, you know, time catches up with you, so to speak. So, I mean, if you even look back to the 1980s or 1960s, that infrastructure that was in the ground was maybe halfway through its lifespan. So it's really hard at that point to say, hey, we need to replace something that's 30 or 40 years old. But really, we're in 2017 now. A lot of that stuff is getting older, and we have to address that. But infrastructure is very expensive. And typically, there's very few road projects that the village does where we don't do some sort of underground improvement as well with water main or sewer. It's just that, you know, the cost and the mileage of pipes that we have is just a really large number. I mean, even at a mile a year, you'd be looking at 52 years to replace all the water main in town. And when you're looking at potentially $300,000, maybe $400,000 per block to replace that main, you can see how it's really kind of hard to come to grasp with the scope of some of the costs that we have to. I mean, we just, you know, based on the community we have, we're a residential bedroom community. We don't have a lot of sales tax or anything to kind of supplement that stuff. So to come up with a infrastructure improvement program that might cost $1 million a year for road and another $1 million a year for underground improvements, that's just not a sustainable approach. So we do the best we can with the funds we have to try to base our projects on the highest priority. Now, I know I did mention before that, you know, a lot of our main is old. That's not to say that all of it needs to be replaced now either. Just because, you know, the American Water Works Society has ductile iron main lifespan typically right around the 75 to 90 year lifespan, which a lot of ours is reaching. That's not to say that that main can't remain in the ground till it's 120 years old. There are certain parts of town where the pipe is old, specifically Forest Hills, for example, but it's doing great. We have very little breaks on it. For the most part, we have don't have a lot of other water quality issues on those pipes, so there's no high priority to address those up front. But there's other sections of town, and Ridgewood is a good example of this, where we have a lot of breaks, and those pipes were put in the 1960s, maybe early 70s. And it could be that those were just a bad batch of pipe from a factory that got installed. We don't know. Could be something with the soils down there. But there's a wide range of time frames that some of this pipe in the ground can kind of remain and exist and continue to be used.
How does Western Springs connect to the deep tunnel?
So the deep tunnel, I don't have a sewer map here, unfortunately. So the deep tunnel is part of the village's sewer system. And I can kind of maybe address this a little bit in this one a little bit. So the deep tunnel, our drop shaft, is located north of Ogden Avenue in the Bemis Woods. I can't remember the cross street, but it's probably right around Woodland or so, maybe just west of that. So everything north of 47th Street in the village is a combined sewer area, which means your stormwater and your sanitary water goes in the same pipe. Everything south of 47th Street is separated water and sewer areas. Clarify that, sanitary and stormwater areas. That section of town does not go to the deep tunnel. They typically drain to Flag Creek for the stormwater. The deep tunnel is basically an overflow mechanism for when you have storm events in combined sewer areas to take on that extra capacity of water. We have basins 1 and 2 that you can see on this form up on this sheet here. Those are what drop us to the north that connect to that deep tunnel system. Basin 3 and 4 does not connect to the deep tunnel, and that's part of some of the separation that projects that's part of our long-term control plan with our NPDES permit that we need to address. Because the other 2 basins do drop to that deep tunnel, those are not necessarily high priority projects for separating that stormwater off. We do not control the drop shafts, the deep tunnel. There are limited scenarios where the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, who does manage that, could close off the deep tunnel based on its capacity if it's full. They're bringing a bunch of their reservoirs online. McCook has a reservoir which should be coming online, I believe, this year, next year, which should help improve that. But that's kind of basically how we end up in connecting to the deep tunnel system.
But you have 2 connections right now.
There's one drop shaft, and then
Open garden.
yeah, there's one drop shaft, and then the other part of Basin 2 doesn't connect directly to a drop shaft, but there's what's known as an MWRD, an interceptor pipe, which then runs further to the east and then goes to the deep tunnel system somewhere over there.
I believe Western Springs has a nearly 40% water loss in the system. To even be able to consider Lake Michigan water, it would need to be at or below 20%. Regardless of using or not using Lake Michigan water, how can or will Western Springs be at a similar loss level?
That's a good question. So I'll provide a little bit of background on that. So Lake Michigan water users are required as part of their lake water allocation to meet certain requirements of water loss or unaccounted for water. They have to be under this 20% and target for that, and they have to take specific investments in programs to try to improve that. We internally, and they have to report that to the Illinois Department of Natural Resources on a form called the LMO2 form. I don't know what the acronym stands for, so don't ask me that one. But it's a reporting form that they have to do annually to kind of account for that water. And on that form, they put in information about how much flow did they use for hydrant flushing, how much flow did they have to use for fire and emergency uses, street sweeping, things like that, where they try to calculate up some of this unaccounted for water. There's also a calculation on that sheet based on the age of your pipe that calculates a potential loss rate based on the mileage and age and size of your water main in the ground. We've used the LMO2 form internally just for our own records. We don't have to submit it to the IDNR because we're not on lake water, but we use it as kind of a measurement stick for where we stand. And yes, depending on some of the estimations we use, because water main breaks are very hard to estimate the actual volume lost. So we have somewhere between about 30 to maybe as high as 45% unaccounted for water based on some of those water main breaks. With that, kind of measurement, we wouldn't be able to really pursue a lake water option directly because of that high unaccounted for water. Now, we've done a number of programs to kind of address the water loss. A lot of it has kind of been exacerbated, or the data has kind of been skewed in the past couple of years because we had abnormally high water main breaks. So 2012 through 14, we had very high water main break numbers. Most of that was just, again, transitioning. We had a change in water chemistry as we brought the RO plant online. And what a lot of that was doing was kind of scouring the pipes, pulling out some of that lime, calcium that was deposited in the pipes. And that was exposing some of the weaknesses in the pipes that we had. So there was a couple of years there where we had 50, 60, 70 plus main breaks in a year. Those have come down significantly. Other programs that we've done some few water lining projects, specifically on a couple pipes that run underneath the railroad tracks for protection. Water main lining is basically you take a liner, inject it through a water main, kind of seals, reestablishes integrity of the pipe, and then kind of basically gives you a new pipe in some ways. It's not the right solution in all instances. It's the best solution really for transmission main where you don't have water services on it. The other thing the village does, we do a leak detection program basically every other year. Leak detection program essentially is we have crews that go out around town. We did it last year. They have a listening device where they tap onto the valves and the hydrants and the buffalo boxes in town. And through this acoustic listening program, they can determine where there's leaks in town. From those leaks, we can follow up. If it's on the village's own public main, we'll do those repairs. if it's on a private water service, and there are actually a fair number on private water services, because you'd be surprised that actually a lot of the water services are just as old as the water main in town. We have to follow up with the resident to have them do those repairs on those water services. And that can account for quite a large number of the unaccounted for loss, because that's loss that's going out into the ground prior to any sort of meter to determine, to get that for accounted water. And then last year we also did some follow-ups, and we've done this for a couple of years. We've been doing some water meter testing. So a lot of the meters that are in all the residential homes, if you don't have a new house, chances are we haven't been back to replace your meter since about 1996. So most of the meters in town are about 20 years old as well. We did some pilot testing on those. We didn't find any significant loss on the meters that we tested, but that is a factor in some cases that could potentially, if the meter is under reading water, it could be accounting for some of that unaccounted for water. So we do have programs in place where we try to address some of that unaccounted for water.
You should tell them that you just started that acoustic monitoring program in 2012 or 2013. Before that, you didn't have it.
Yeah, that's correct. We did start kind of that regular program right around 2012 with the coordination with the Infrastructure Commission on that. We've done it in the past prior to that, but we didn't have any sort of regular routine that we established with that listening program. Simply because at that time, when we were still on Lime soft listening, it just wasn't that big of a concern in terms of what people were monitoring at that time.
And if I recall, you're saving about 70 million gallons a year by the acoustic monitoring program.
Yeah, that's what some of those have identified. There was actually a really large leak we found on last year's program that Aaron and Casey from my office coordinated with up in the Forest Preserve. There's a main that feeds up in the Forest Preserve for the bathrooms up there. And how much do you think? That was a big leak.
It was a fairly large leak.
Yeah, so we coordinated with the Forest Preserve to get that repaired last year, probably last fall, late last summer.
Late last summer.
Yeah.
So following last year's leak detection program, we've been monitoring our savings closely, and on average, we see a savings of approximately 400,000 gallons per day. So that's a significant improvement from where we sat at this time last year.
It is. Next question.
Okay. So, in your opinion, on a scale of 1 to 10, how acute is the problem of replacing infrastructure?
How acute? So how important, I guess, is the question?
Right.
Well, I'm biased since I'm the director of municipal services, so it's pretty important. I don't know if I can really give it a number. I mean, it's hard to balance this in terms of, we still have to provide police and fire protection at the end of the day. There's a lot of services that the village provides that, have to be stretched by both tax dollars as well as the fees and use charges that the village has that comes into us. The water is one of the most important things we do. It's a public health and safety issue, and our goal is to provide the best water we can. And I think really the key component that we need to focus on is, because our funds are limited and we don't have $40 million sitting in the bank to just fix everything, we have to really focus on, for the funds that we do have on those projects, target the projects that really are the most important. I think, the rehabilitation of the water treatment plants that we did a few years ago was the most important project at the time. We had a lime softening treatment plant, which was completely manual process, that was largely the same lime softening treatment plant that was used in 1932 when it was originally constructed. And it did get rehabilitated a little bit itself in the 1950s, but you were looking at a 50-plus-year-old water treatment plant at that time. And that needed to be rehabilitated. That was the highest priority project at that time. But I think the Water Study Group and the board, the Infrastructure Commission at that time, was keenly aware that, it's not build this plant, we're done, we're walking away. There's a lot of infrastructure that does need to be addressed. Really the next steps, that we're kind of building out here is, and we've kind of talked about this a little bit already, is, so where are the problems? Well, number one, that's a problem. And we really need to focus on dealing with the well number one water, either treating it or just getting rid of well number one. And then really it kind of goes out from there of addressing the infrastructure stuff. I think our 2 storage facilities are probably right now the next highest priority on the list, because that, once the water leaves the plant, it goes there first before it really kind of goes out to distribution. Our storage facilities are actually in pretty good shape, even though they were built in the 60s, but they're just due for the regular maintenance at this point. Typically, you want to paint your tanks to ensure you don't have any sort of corrosion issues on them about every 10 to 15 years. And both of them are right in that wheelhouse right now. Last time they were done was, I believe, the late 90s. So those are going to be the next high priority projects that we're getting on there. And then from there, it's working through that distribution system. And again, we have to balance that with some of the sewer projects and some of the high priority, because if you have certain sections of town when they get a 50 or 100-year storm event, and you have residents who have water coming in their basements or up to the foundation of their house, that might be at that time the higher priority project that we need to address at that time. So we balance all those projects as we kind of work through some of our infrastructure planning.
So I think you pretty much answered the follow-up question, but it said, in a perfect world, how would you approach these problems?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, we would just do all the projects. I would have about $45 million to tackle everything, and we just crank it out. But even though I joke about that, but even if we did have all the money in the world, I think you have to kind of keep in mind the scale of our infrastructure. Like I said, we have 52 miles of pipe for water main, more than that even for our sewer. And even at a mile a year, you're looking at 50 years worth of projects. And if any of you have seen me out, been lucky enough to have us reconstruct your street, you know that a reconstruction is a long and dirty and stressful process. So any infrastructure reconstruction project that we do on your block, unfortunately, is inconvenient. So it's not easy. It is hard to kind of deal with this stuff. When we have to tear up the street and rebuild something, you're out of your driveway for 3 months. And you might have to deal with, the construction equipment, the dust, the noise, and everything that comes with that. So even if we had all the money in the world, it's not something we'd be able to address in the next couple of years. So that's why, again, we kind of focus on the highest priority, the biggest bang for the buck projects, so to speak.
How do Western Springs water rates compare to other suburbs?
Great question, because I have a chart for that. Let's see. So we are pretty much right in the middle. This is a survey that the finance department did. I don't know if she did it, but collected the information from somewhere. And these are most of the neighboring communities around us. So one thing I'll just kind of point out with this, there's a lot of numbers here, but our rate, which is $12, is a combined rate. So it's a water and sewer rate. Many other communities have a separate water and sewer rate. And it's just important to keep that in note. Not all of them do that, but when you tally up and compare numbers between different communities, you just want to make sure you're factoring that in when you take into account for comparison. So you can see we kind of fall almost directly in the middle between a lot of the neighboring communities in the area.
Was that also breaks? Wasn't the question about breaks?
Is there a follow-up part on there?
No, it just says, how do Western Springs water rates compare to other
Rates.
suburbs?
I'm sorry,
yeah.
I misunderstood.
Yeah.
Will the widening construction on 294 impact well number 4?
Good question. So the project that's going on in 294, we've met multiple times with representatives from the tollway on that. So they are aware of the sensitivity of well number 4 down at the Public Works Garage. I'll go back to that one location slide. So what you can see down here, well number 4 is all the way down at the western side of Hillgrove Avenue. And if you've been following any of the news and the information, the tollway is planning on reconstructing the tri-state here in the next several years. The main work on the tri-state's probably not going to happen until 2020 or later. But leading up to that, they have to replace the bridge that goes over the tollway for the railroad. And that is going to be a bigger project that we're going to see sooner. We don't have a date on that yet. There was actually a meeting, not specifically for that, but there was a tollway meeting prior to this one to discuss the kind of I-88-290 interchange. So the tollway is just now beginning to ramp up some of their own public meeting processes to discuss, get public feedback, and they're going to be doing their own engineering reports. They're planning on having what they call their master plan, which is kind of their design intentions, done sometime this fall. And then there will be a public hearing process through that. So going back to the question at hand, though, how is that project going to impact well number 4? We've made it clear to the tollway that that project cannot significantly impact well number 4, and that they are going to have to provide protections for that well and for the transmission line to the water treatment plants. And they have been agreeable in all of our conversations to understand that, yes, we are keenly aware of that well will not be offline. That's not to say that there might be brief periods where we would cooperate with them to bring it offline for less than 24 hours if they're doing something. But we're not going to allow any sort of extended takedown of that well as part of the construction process. What sort of protections are going to go in place, we don't know yet, because they don't really know exactly what they're doing out there yet. The most recent information we've had, which is on the village website, is going to be what's known as a shoe fly, which is going to be a new berm that's going to be built adjacent to the railroad tracks. Right now, they're proposing to build that all on the south side of the railroad tracks to allow new tracks to be swung to the south and cross over 294. That'll allow them to then deconstruct the bridge that's currently there, put a new bridge back up, and then bring those tracks back over. A lot of that specific track work and design is actually dictated by the BNSF themselves, and the tollway just has to basically accept it and then construct it for them. But those conversations will be kind of ongoing as we kind of get further into it.
Matt, you might emphasize that if you take well number 4 off for 24 hours, you have enough water supply in your tanks to supply the village, and you don't have to put on well number 1.
That's true. Is any sort of planned offline if we did need to temporarily take 4 down to cooperate, if they're doing pile driving or something like that? Yes, we have capacity within our distribution system that we don't have to, typically bring well number 1 online through any sort of maintenance like that.
Just bring that up so you don't panic everybody into an iron mode.
Yeah, that's a good point. And yes, good point.
Is there any federal or state money for infrastructure?
Not that we're really aware of at this time, but we are pursuing this IEPA loan, which I mentioned before. So the IEPA loan is managed by the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. It's known as the Revolving Loan Fund. It is a self-funded program, which means that the money that comes back in from the interest on the loans, it's done for other projects, self-funds it. So it's not tied into the state's budget or anything like that. We've participated in that. The water treatment plant was constructed with that loan, as well. There was a number of sewer projects in the early 2000s that the village did that was tied to that loan. Most of the infrastructure that we've identified going forward that needs major replacement, we are looking at to use that loan program to identify and fund that. To my knowledge, there are no federal or state other grants or programs that work with that. Any sort of grants, especially on the federal level, that typically are available either for very large projects, even ours are a couple million, that's not big enough for a federal program. They're looking for 30, 40, 50, $100 million projects. Or they're looking for regional improvements, regional transportation, regional infrastructure improvement. They would be looking for projects like a state or federal highway where you're doing mass transit or commerce improvements or something like that. So, but there's no other programs for local governments on those sorts of projects that we're aware of.
Okay. Can well number 1 be re-drilled or drilled deeper to reach a better quality water?
That is possible, but there are a couple other issues with well number 1 why we would probably not want to do that. So well number 1, based on its construction and its age, is what's known as a non-compliant well. So what does that mean? So well number 1 is constructed in 1924. When they constructed it at that time, rules and regulations regarding well construction and water were different. The actual well head, or where the well surfaces from the ground, is below grade. Any sort of new well construction in both 3 and 4 Rs are not allowed to do that. They have to be constructed above grade, which means above the surface level. And basically the reason why that is you don't allow any sort of contaminants if you had a spill or oil spill, anything like that, to be able to go down into that well shaft and then contaminate the aquifer. So well number 1 is not compliant on that respect. And it's grandfathered in because of its age. The other big issue why we probably would not want to do that, and what actually would make it probably very difficult to drill it any deeper, is its proximity to the railroad tracks. It's located in the BNSF right-of-way, probably 25 feet from the railroad. The railroad would almost certainly not allow us to put a derrick and a rig that big next to the railroad to drill down deeper. So really our options for well number 1 is keep its configuration as it is, and find some sort of treatment option off-site from it as we bring it to distribution, or you find a replacement for well number 1. But working on that site, and if you guys ever look when you leave tonight, it's the red brick building right on the corner of Burlington and Wolf. You'll see it. You probably never even knew as well, but that's what that building is. That's the well.
Okay, and then I guess
Okay.
some comments from John Medell.
Okay. John, you have some comments?
Yes, I just.
Okay. Well, come on up so we can have you on the mic.
Go ahead.
Well, no, that's the only question I got left here.
Okay, I could be the last, but
Okay.
I have a time, a few minutes.
Okay.
I think I asked you.
Are there any other questions in the baskets that we haven't grabbed?
I don't think so.
I just have a question on well number 5.
Yes.
Where is that located?
So, well number 5, we don't have.
Or would it be?
Yeah. So right now, there are a couple questions. Good. Let me find that one. So the Infrastructure Commission, Public Works and Water Committee, about a year ago, conducted a report for well number 5 locations, and you can find that report on the village website. It's called the well number 5 locations report, where they looked at basically where do we have open land in the village that we could potentially build a new well on. After reviewing it, there was a number of feasible locations, but the most feasible location would be near Field Park. It's got open green space. It's north of the railroad tracks, which means we wouldn't have to put a new distribution main underneath the railroad tracks, because whenever you get BNSF involved, you're adding years to any project. They're great, but they're difficult to work with because you're going underneath the railroad. And it would be easy to run a new main to the existing water treatment plants to integrate it with our existing equipment there. So that's the kind of the proposed potential location right now. So what we're doing right now, what the village board will be approving at the end of this month, is kind of the first step in the engineering to determine the feasibility if that location truly works, which is this 3-4 interference test. And really what that interference test has to do, this is kind of a quick thing. There's this thing called a cone of depression with any well when you have an aquifer in the ground. And when you have 2 wells that are operating, they draw down from that aquifer. And you can see on the bottom image here, you have this cone of depression. And this is, just an illustration, but it gives you an idea of kind of what happens with that aquifer. So we would want to make sure that based on the proximity to Field Park, if we did have a well there, that it wouldn't draw down, have a cone of depression that would influence well number 3 at Village Hall. Because if you negatively impact the potential for well number 3 to output water, that location of Field Park might not be the best location. And we'd have to determine what sort of influence it might have, if at any at all, and then what sort of alternatives do we have from that.
Because in the past, they were always talking about getting it away from the railroad in case there was a spill. But then you're mentioning now, when you were discussing well number 1, that they have to do it above ground, so that's no longer
Yeah, so
critical?
that is a factor that was looked at in the well number 5 kind of analysis report. So both well number 3 and 4, if you look at the wellhead, it's probably about 3 feet above ground. It's a large concrete block, prevents any sort of spill going in there. The proximity to the railroad track was something that was discussed, and there's a minor concern there, but between the distances between 3 and 4 and potentially 5, even if you were to have an accident on the railroad tracks, the likelihood or the probability of really having something negatively impact the wells is fairly minor for those other wells. Even well number 3, which is probably the closest here, you're still looking several hundred feet away from the railroad track. Well number 4 is about a mile down from the railroad track down there. So I suppose I say yes, there's always that probability that something could happen, but it's a very low probability based on kind of the risk assessment that we looked at for those adjacency to the wells.
City Hall, right?
Correct.
The railroad train would have to go through City Hall.
You'd have to blow up City Hall basically to get to the well.
No, I don't mean an accident with cars. I meant a spill of
Yeah, like if you had an oil tanker sort of thing. Yeah, yeah.
something going into the soil and then getting into the...
Yeah, so that sort of stuff, typically, these aquifers are very deep. They're about 1,200 feet deep. So any sort of surface level spill just at ground level is most likely not going to influence them. In most parts of the town, you have bedrock probably about 20 or 30 feet down. So even a spill that penetrates through the soil is really not going to penetrate through bedrock on a short-term basis. And then there would be a cleanup or remediation process if there was some sort of railroad accident. the issue specifically, as you're kind of asking for well number one, is if some liquid could physically, roll downhill and go down the well pipe if there's some sort of exposure there. We wouldn't really have that scenario here at 3 or 4.
Why was the part that failed in well 3 not a stocked part, since it has such a long lead time?
Sure. So the short answer is that is because it is a custom fabricated part for the well. The wells are not off-the-shelf components, really. The component that failed, that got damaged, was basically the transformers inside the well house that run the electricity to it. Those are, again, all custom parts. It's really not feasible to have those just sitting somewhere because they are very expensive, and we've never really had a failure. They're typically a very low failure mechanism. They're largely the same components that have been there for a long time.
And the mechanism didn't just fail. There
Correct.
was an incident,
There was an incident
that caused it to fail. So
Mhm.
it wasn't something that was expected or even scheduled. It was an accident that caused it to fail.
That's a good point. So it wasn't that the component just blew up on its own.
Correct.
And I can't really get into the specifics because there's an OSHA investigation associated with that. But there was something that caused the incident that occurred that created the accident.
And the only reason that we're actually up and running right now is because we did have redundancy in the well house that we were able to use. So there were parts in the well house that were able to be used to get us back up and running. But no, these parts aren't something that you just have on the shelf somewhere. Okay. What is the arsenic level in each well, and does the RO plant lower that level? So I don't know the levels offhand, but they are available at the IEPA's Water Watch website, and we are required to test every 3 years. And we test actually all 3 well houses every 3 years. And yes, the RO plant does lower those levels.
And you can find the Water Watch either by Googling, but we also have it linked on the village's website. So all of our water data, if you go to wsprings.com/water, there's links right there. It'll take you to our water data. It'll explain to you what our testing cycle and process is, and you can get directly to the IEPA's website. And on the IEPA's website, they also do tell you where we do those tests in town.
And then I also put a brief sort of summary of the water testing that we do regularly on the back of this handout,
Yeah.
just so that you have it.
And if anybody hasn't seen it, there is a handout that nice handout that Aaron put together that was up by the front. So feel free to take that if you haven't seen it. We'll also put that on the village website tomorrow.
What are the roadblocks, if any, to having Ridgewood's water source tied into the LaGrange Highlands? Thus, Western Springs water distribution would terminate at 55th Street.
Sure. So there's a couple issues related to that. One, Ridgewood is not part of LaGrange Highlands. It's part of our system, so you'd have to get some sort of IDNR approval, most likely, to have them tie into it. You'd have to have LaGrange Highlands want to accept Ridgewood. So as I kind of mentioned before, Ridgewood has some very specific problems with its distribution main. There are the dead ends, which create water quality problems, as well as the number of breaks on the west side of town. Changing to lake water would not solve either of those problems. In some cases, it may make it worse. The LaGrange Highlands system pressure is higher than Village of Western Springs system pressure, so you may exacerbate some water main break problems in that specific area. And just coming from my side, if LaGrange Highlands came to me and said, hey, we got this section of town with some not great main, we want you guys to have it, I would say, no way. You guys have to fix all of that first, and then we'll consider taking it over. So it wouldn't make sense for us to put the investment into that water main and then hand it over to LaGrange Highlands, let alone from all of the other sort of regulatory issues that may come into play. The other thing that has been kind of asked about that is, if we take one of the subdivisions, Ridgewood in this case, offline to LaGrange Highlands, does that provide any sort of overhead or additional capacity or less strain on our output? Ridgewood is actually one of the lower usage subdivisions in town. Out of, typically we output, what's our typical output from the plants?
1.4 million gallons per day.
About 1.4 million gallons. From our analysis from the meter reading, we're putting at about 85,000 to 100,000 gallons a day for the Ridgewood subdivision. So comparatively, it's a very small portion of the water that's actually getting consumed to that subdivision. So it wouldn't taking that offline would not provide any sort of relief or anything like that to the plant. Not that we need relief. We do have excess overhead capacity for our water treatment plant and both of our wells. So in terms of output capacity, we're not really stretched in any way from whatever our current system is.
Will village costs of well 3 failure be covered by insurance?
I don't know the answer to that. I know we are working with the insurance company on that process, but I don't know what the answer to that is offhand. Any other questions kind of floating in baskets?
Okay.
John, did you want to make your comments?
I'll be quick.
There's a question.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Communities in the area that have
Yeah.
RO that aren't on Lake Michigan.
Say that again?
Who else uses RO plants or
The-
deep wells?
There's off the top of my head, I know the city of Geneva does.
Geneva. Spring Valley does.
Yeah, and most of the rest of the state of Illinois, who's not around Chicago, so I mean like all the central and southern, I don't know if they're using RO specifically, but they're all using aquifer-based systems. But yeah, Spring Valley and Geneva specifically, when we were going through the RO process back in '07, we went and toured both of those facilities.
One quick question. Do I understand that when you use well 1, you can bypass the RO plant?
That's correct. So the question was,
The distribution system.
yeah, the question was, do we bypass the RO plant when we use well number 1? That's correct. So well number 1, because it's a smaller well, it's shallower, it doesn't have the output capacity, and the water quality is different. The RO plant was not designed to accept well number 1, and because well number 1 is really designated as our emergency well. So when we do have to run it, we basically chlorinate. Aaron chlorinates it, sends it to the reservoir, which is behind the water treatment plant, and then it goes out to distribution. So it has no softening process that's going on to it
So
currently.
basically, you kind of back up and use the old processing system?
There
But
is no-
but it's still blended with the
Right.
water that's being treated at the plant.
Right.
you
So
blend
it's
So we're not
Okay.
solely using
So
well
it's not
1,
pure
it's still,
well
yes,
water.
it's
yeah.
still
So
blended back.
just for conversation's sake, so when this most recent, so we had well number 4 operating essentially on a 24-hour basis. Let's just say that's outputting 1 million gallons, and it's just a round number. I don't know if that's what the number actually is per day. You know, if system demand is 1.2 million, we would have to supplement with a 200,000 gallon, and that would really depend. You know, it depends on the season and the weather out. So when it's a really hot, dry day,
Yeah.
everybody's using water. And we noticed there's a big change, you know, between what the usage scenarios look like in February and what it looks like in July and August. So how much we have to run well number 1 does vary depending on the time of the year as well as the particular weather on that particular day. I guess it's your show, John.
Okay, and this is on.
Yeah, I can see the green light, so it looks like it's on.
In regards to...
Do you want to actually stand up here so we can get you on camera?
Who's on camera?
Oh, is he on camera? Oh, I got to move him now, sorry.
In line of fire?
Yeah.
Yeah, in regards to this mobile RO, I urge that the village have the pilot tests really before investing any more money, because the results of those tests could drastically shift the design on what you might want for that type of an RO. The other point is I also urge that the village prepare a report for the residents and post it on the web pages. And I can feel the groans from the board members and the staff, but before they vote, I think the residents owed this opportunity. The meetings in the middle of the summer were always suspect because the attendance and the knowledge that the people had about what was going on was minimal at that time. The newspaper's article that I read, I found confused, but most of what would be in a report to the residents is already prepared. So I think it's just a few more things that would need to be added. but when at the time back and then when we began the RO, we had a full report on that. There was plenty of opportunity and time for the residents to review that and give us whatever comments they had. And it all went very smoothly, I believe. But also at that time, there was a popular expression on our board, and that was open and transparent. And I think that's an important relation to have with the residents, because it provides confidence to the public. And two other side things. The TARP came up here, and the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District is having tours of the McCook facilities, both the pump and the reservoir.
Mm-hmm.
So you may want to spread the word on that, and just go to their website and sign up for a tour. And finally, do you have remember the slide with the water quality? This is just with the water quality in terms of what's in it, of various types of chemicals. I'm just there you go.
Is this the one you're looking for?
All right. Yeah. In the one within the red borders, it warms my heart to because I was involved with the reverse osmosis to point out that all of the areas in Western Springs that have reverse osmosis has a softer water than the Timber Trails, which has Chicago or lake water.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. And just so everybody knows, so who John is, who don't know, John is a former trustee, chair of the Public Works and Water Committee, and he was involved with the Water Study Group back with the mid-2000s when we were doing the research on the rehabilitation for the water treatment plant. So he lived, eaten, breathed this whole process back in 2007 and such. Any other questions this evening?
What do you say for people who are still experiencing groundwater or issues within their system? I mean, we see, online, people are posting quite often pictures of groundwater, saying their laundry is damaged from it. First of all, what do you say about that? And secondly, what can be done to correct laundry or like a damage of a sink, a basin or something like that?
Sure.
As a result of that?
So if you've had water issues recently, most likely it was caused, again, we were doing construction with the East Train platforms yesterday, and we had to open a hydrant. There's a hydrant out there that has to be disconnected as part of that project and removed. So that caused some unexpected problems yesterday. We went and knocked on doors ahead of time for the residents in the immediate area, but unfortunately we saw problems as far away as 51st Street, 6 or 7 blocks away, which surprised us. So we put an announcement up after we started getting phone calls about that and realizing people further away were getting that. If you're having other problems, most of the problems should be resolved now that we have all of our equipment back online and softening through the plant, and things should stabilize. As I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, we are going to be doing some evaluation whether it makes sense to do hydrant flushing this fall. We don't necessarily want to make the situation worse by disturbing everything after everybody's kind of gotten through this process this summer here. So I don't know if we're going to do that yet. Typically, we do hydrant flushing every spring, and that is a process that does get all that sediment that's built up over the year out of the pipes. Regards to laundry, if you do have issues with your laundry, I would recommend contacting the water departments. Erin and her staff have, I don't know the name of the product.
It's actually just called Rust Remover.
Okay.
Yeah.
They have something that can help residents out with that. One thing I'll caution, too, if you do have issues with, you're washing your whites and you're getting iron issues or rust, don't bleach your whites. Actually, bleach is the worst thing you could do because, as I mentioned before, chlorine, which is what bleach is an oxidizer. And chlorine will react with the iron in the water, actually draw it out of solution, and make the problem worse. So chlorine is a negatively charged particle, negatively charged. Iron is positively charged, and they will react with each other. So chlorine, in that particular scenario, will actually not solve the problem with your whites. That's why Aaron will have some products with that. Typically, if you do have some discoloration, if it's especially after we've had a water main break, or after we've done some hydrant flushing and you really need to do some laundry, always try to just run a cold water tap in your house to make sure the water runs clear. If you can, just do your laundry on a cold cycle. That typically helps as well.
More of a suggestion than anything else. Most residents do not take a bucket and empty their hot water heaters periodically. And that is one way to prolong the life of your hot water heater. It's amazing how much stuff will come out.
That is actually a good, so one of the things with hot water heaters is they do recommend you once a year just drain your hot water heater. And regardless of what type of system you have, you're going to have some sediment built up. It's natural because of the heating coils. Those heating coils will draw out any sediment or mineralization that's naturally occurring in the water. So yeah, if you want to flush it out, we're actually working on right now kind of improving the FAQ section on the water side of the site, because we have questions like that which are not really technical or chemistry-based questions, but we do occasionally get those, and we're kind of compiling some of those more everyday questions to put those on the website and not just have the technical answers, the chemistry answers.
This question is a little bit off topic, but years ago you had that program where you were pushing new pipe from the street to the house to replace lead pipe or whatever. Is that still in place? Or
so the only time we actively do any sort of service main replacement is if we're doing a road construction project and we're also replacing the water main. We will coordinate, so in Western Springs, the service line is owned by the homeowner, but we would coordinate with any homeowner on a project if they want to work with our contractor or with their own plumber to coordinate when we do a construction project to do that. But we don't actively have any sort of program right now that just replaces service lines throughout the community. Yeah.
That was how many years ago? 10, 15?
It's before me, so I don't know, unfortunately.
I think it was almost 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I got here late, so I apologize if this is redundant, but what are the top 5 common problems that residents have had?
Sure. So
and what ones can we expect to relent, and what ones can we expect to maybe see in the future?
Yeah, so the question was kind of what are the top 5 problems. So the biggest issues I had, what I kind of mentioned, is probably our infrastructure and kind of the water quality associated with that. So the well number 1, our distribution system and our storage facilities. And kind of those are really the big issues, is kind of address those.
How does that manifest in my house?
In terms of what water quality you see?
Pressure, clogging.
So are there any problems you're typically seeing?
Yes.
Okay. Where do you live in town?
Old Town.
Okay. So there's a couple different things that can come into play, and we don't, when we're looking at infrastructure improvements, we can't really look at it on a house-by-house basis. We look at it on a system-wide or regional basis. So we look at issues of water main replacement, typically coordinated with a roadway improvement program. If you do have specific issues with your house, some of that could be related to the age of your house. If you have an older home, it could be the water service. It could be the water meter. If it's the water meter, you can give the Public Works Department a call. We'll come out and inspect the meter. If it needs to be replaced, we'll coordinate for replacement on that. If you have a water service that's just old, and so if you live in a house that's from 1930 and your water service is the same age, you might have to replace the water service. So that's something the village can't do. That would be on the homeowner to replace their water service. But we could come out and kind of talk with you about it and coordinate if that's an issue you're experiencing.
You know, when I had my line done, one of the things that we found out was we were sharing a line with the house next door.
That's actually more common than you think in some of the Old Town area.
The sidewalk and then
there's a Y in the system, yep.
So after that replacement was done, the pressure was obviously
yeah.
up.
That's actually common with some of the really old homes,
Yeah.
where a single developer built both homes. And there's a single B box or Buffalo box, and it Y's off in the front yard somewhere. Go ahead.
So to clarify, the contemplating well number 5 being built, is that to eliminate all use of well number 1?
That would be the intent, yes.
That is why.
We would almost certainly abandon well number 1 and cap it if well number 5 is constructed.
It's gonna be a little long-winded, so I'll try to make it short. And I'm trying to catch up. I wasn't here in 2007, so I
Sure.
don't know the entire background. And I've found the report and read through most of it. It seems. Was well number 5 anticipated from that report? I did not see anything highlighting that, because I believe I've read that well number 5 is $3 million or something along those lines. You've already spent $8 million, and I'm reading things, so I'm hopefully guessing all right. And the report showed that connecting to Lake Michigan water was $5 million, or roughly 4.8, I think, in 2007. There was a report. The report conducted a cost of year 1, year 5. We're now at year 10. We're having to dig a 5th well. That's going to cost us $3 million. What about 5 years from now, 10 years from now, where we are continually having to fight our infrastructure that obviously needs to be repaired, but continually having to maybe dig more wells, maintain the wells? Has that cost been considered, as opposed to, again, hooking up to Lake Michigan water, where we defer a lot of those costs, or at least in my opinion, I don't know for sure.
Yeah.
How is that kind of all brought together? Because that seems, the infrastructure, that's an issue we have to deal with. I mean, okay, we have to deal with that. And that may cause us some problems. But the source of our water, that seems to be piling up more and more as far as a cost. And is that the correct, did we make a bad decision back then, and should we correct it now, or have we even considered that?
So the Water Study Group report itself did not address those, because that was a report for the water plants and the options for the water plants, or basically the source. And it was lake water, because it looked at essentially 3 options: continuing lime softening, RO, and lake water. And it was a question really of what do we do with this water treatment plants. The issue of a new well has been discussed in the village in various capacities since the 1970s. It's been discussed from a staff level, and at least since I've been here, I've been here since 2007. So I caught the tail end of the Water Study Group stuff. Has always been discussed from a staff level, not necessarily as high priority as maybe we've discussed it now, but it's something that's been floating out there because we know the age of the infrastructure that's out there. Regarding kind of where we go forward with some of this stuff, the water plant, that investment has been made, and I think everything we have, and I think the evidence proves it out, that it was a good investment. The water quality coming out of that is good. The separate question really comes down to, this well we're treating number 1 and that sort of thing. And that's something the village board is reviewing with staff at this time. We are in the thick of it right now at this process. And even the Water Study Group, the Infrastructure Commission's well number 5 report, they were looking at a 5 to 7 year kind of process potentially here for this well number 5 as we kind of review that process. What was the next part of your question?
Just the overall, so it seems that we're going to be, I can't even call it nickel to dime because we're talking millions of dollars here.
Right.
But over time, we're adding more and more to that bill. Where potentially, and again, I'm a layman, I don't necessarily know everything here, but connecting to Lake Michigan, we would potentially defer some of those maintenance issues, some of the well maintenance, some of the digging another, do we have to dig a well 6 someday? Those kind of things. So,
so the answer is kind of yes and no with a little bit of that. So, if let's say we did go to lake water, you'd still have to have potentially some wells available as a backup solution. You would not want to have lake water as your primary and then a lake water connection as your backup. The other thing you have to keep in mind, if you do go with lake water, you are purchasing water from another community. So those funds are leaving our community and going to another community. So in some ways, those funds are not available to be invested back into our own distribution system and infrastructure. There
would be cost, cutting costs, right? You wouldn't have quite the maintaining. cost. Is
I
that
don't,
correct?
I don't know if that's fair to say. I don't know if we have the data to really support any sort of cutting costs. I mean,
I
you'd
don't
have to,
know what I'm
you'd have to, I don't know the answer to that. But you would have to purchase water from a third party, buy that water, and then they set that price for what that water would be, which then gets set by the seller before them, most likely the city of Chicago. So you would not have any sort of, there's other sort of non-monetary things that kind of come into play to that. One of the large discussions that the village board had back in 2007, 2008 was a little bit of this, controlling our own destiny. Being in control of your own water source allows you to target and adjust for future IEPA regulations. So, for example, we know that there's been modifications to the fluoride recommendations from both the US and the IEPA. There's other adjustments potentially going to some other regulations that always are modifications. And having us to be in control of that with the RO system, we're able to do that with some of the blend rates and the way we conduct those operations. The other thing that kind of comes to play is tied in with that water loss that we had. That is a factor that would impact whether lake water is feasible or not. Because even if we're, so let's say we bill the residents 5 million gallons gets to your house, but if we have to purchase 10 million gallons and 5 million of that gets lost to the ground, that's a lot of money that's just going out the door. Whereas that's not necessarily, it's still a problem we have to deal with, but not necessarily as big of a problem that we're dealing with when we produce our own. Plus there's other things just in terms of kind of community culture a little bit. We don't have watering restrictions in town. There's not as strict regulations about, just the way you can use and irrigate and stuff like that. Whereas if you're on lake water, that is something that would have to be strictly enforced. It's just another thing that would have to be kind of taken into account with that.
The costs you showed for the various suburbs, what will those look like? What could those look like in several years? I understand the city of Chicago has the rates are capped right now, but I think, 2 or 3 years down the road, aren't they able to raise those rates further?
I don't know the details on that. I mean, I think it's probably safe to say that across the board, rates are probably going to go up for everybody, because for the city of Chicago and everybody else as well, because there is infrastructure that needs to be improved. I don't know what the city of Chicago plans are look like, and then the other thing that needs to be taken into account is how do those other communities then pass through those rates. Depending on the reselling community, some of them add their own rate increase on top of the city of Chicago's. Not all of them do, but some do. And so it's kind of hard to predict exactly what those rates might be and how that might kind of come into play with us.
Matt, you just might want to mention also, the surrounding communities, the suburbs have been fighting this, the rates that have been going up, and there has been a cap right now, but I can assure you that Mayor Emanuel and also the city of Chicago intends to increase those rates, because they understand, that they are now beholden to them, so that's one thing. You might also want to comment on the quality of lake water too. Everyone thinks that that's the best, but really, we're seeing a lot more issues with lake water also, correct? With chemicals that go in there and so forth.
Well, I think Matt touched on that already. So for example, we have naturally occurring fluoride here from our wells, whereas with lake water, they actually have to add fluoride to be between 0.9 and 1.2 milligrams per liter. And there are quite a few debates on there about whether or not adding fluoride to the water is acceptable. Also, they're dealing with algae blooms. So things like that we don't have to worry about here.
Yeah, I think you should mention that the cost of hooking up to Lake Michigan water could be astronomical. We discussed that before, that $5 million was kind of a low end. They say it could have been, in 2007, they said it could have been as high as $12 million.
Yeah, there's a wide range on that. The Water Study Group report did right around that $5 million mark. I mean, that is a 10-year-old number now at this point. There were conversations that I were in where they were saying, yeah, it could be as high as $10 million. I don't want to say that as any sort of that's what it is or anything like that. I would just kind of reiterate that we did make an investment in the water treatment plants, I think we have to continue with that investment, but that investment also, I think, has proved itself as being a worthwhile investment in that it produces really good water. And it's not the RO plant that is the cause of the problems that we're experiencing. There are other issues that we have to deal with, and there's correct solutions to those, and I think we've kind of demonstrated that lake water is not going to solve those specific problems.
I just wanted, if you don't mind, if I give perspective on what, just because I was...
Wait, let's grab, we got to get you on a mic.
Oh, sorry. I was chairman of Public Works and Water when we did this in 2007, 2008. And as John Medell was the previous one before me, and at that time when we were putting these numbers together, the costs for Lake Michigan water were a little bit less, or no, were going to be a little bit more than just maintaining the water treatment plant. The two things that happened since then is right after we made our decision, at that time Mayor Daley had like a 4 or 5 point escalation in fees. Mayor Emanuel came in, he also had like a 3 or 4 year escalation in fees. And then the other thing that really is changed dramatically since we were there is wells 3 and 4, our mainstay wells, were for many years producing great water without anything, without any problem. The biggest change came, and Matt referred to this about the EPA. The EPA made these restrictions about radium, and it was because of radium that they had to treat the water to do that. They're controversial in itself whether or not those were needed at the time, but we've met that and done that. And the difference is that as far as I know, I don't hear any other testimony or heard anything since then, is we're one of the only communities in the whole area that has our own wells. Now, the concept that most people have of wells is stinky water. And unfortunately, well number 1 gives us that. Okay, it smells. It's got a lot of the oxides in it, and it looks bad. Wells 3 and 4, however, are totally different. Those are 1,600 feet, 1,900 feet. The quality of the water is excellent, and when we don't have to use well number 1, our water is better than the Lake Michigan water. And there are also things that happen in some of the water that they can't screen out in Lake Michigan water. For example, people were throwing their discarded medications in there, and they were finding a lot of, quite a bit. They don't know whether or not it's significant in terms of causing people health problems, but that was one of the things that they found, dissolved medications in high number of quantities in the water in Lake Michigan. So the biggest change has been is the problems that we've had with at that time the very reliable wells 3 and 4. So 5 is a good idea to do that. As soon as we get away from well number 1, we're going to have a great system. I mean, the only time we need that is because I think ComEd pushed us into the summertime for our construction of our refitting the water plant, and that's why we had to use well number 1 back then. And then of course on Easter we had, I think something happened. I forgot what happened to the well, but that those were just kind of unforeseen. But when everything's working, our water is probably better than Lake Michigan water. So I'm just trying to give you a historical perspective on what we looked at back then and what's changed in the meantime.
I think from a resident's point of view, the thing is when it's working. That's what we're concerned about, when it's working.
Sure.
Because we've been told over and over, well, this is a unusual thing that just happened, like this thing with well 3, or we're going to have to change those filters or whatever that thing was. It just seems like it's always going to be something. And it seems like where all the reports say that well number 1 is an emergency well, it seems to me more and more it's not that unusual that we're using it. So I think it's a little deceiving to think that we're not drinking that well number 1 blended. I mean, that was what Crestwood had when they had a well. Was that contaminated with dry clean solvent?
I'm not sure what the Crestwood scenario.
Totally different. They had a well and they were blending it with their lake water
but it was contaminated.
But but wasn't it contaminated with dry cleaning solvent?
It was a known contamination though.
But we also had 2 abandoned dry cleaners right by that.
But
Have we tested for that?
Yeah.
We regularly test every year.
And the other thing is, I saw something that Baxter, Woodman, that did our report, right? Told Shorewood that, I think they made a recommendation for them to go to Lake Water because the Galesville, is that one of our aquifers?
That's one of ours, yes.
That they're suggesting that, and I know the levels have gone up because we're like the only ones that are still using it east of the Fox River has. I mean, if you ever see a map, Western Springs is like
we are an island, yes.
We are a very pinpoint of everyone else. So I don't know how everyone else could be wrong and we're right. But anyway, they said that the aquifer could be dewatered. I'm guessing that means the level.
I'm not sure what the context. No, dewatering.
2050, or what does that mean?
Dewatering. I don't know the context of the report because I haven't read it. But dewatering is typically a process when you're doing some sort of construction where you're removing silt from water. So, for example, if you're building a retention basin or something and you need to excavate out, you have basically a large silt bag, and you capture the silt in that and squeeze the water through it, and that water goes into a retention area.
They said that would happen by 2050.
Well, again, I haven't read that. I don't know what the context is of that report.
That was from 2014 to sure.
So, I'm not sure what that report's referring to. Go ahead.
The circumstances down by Shorewood are different as well. They have Joliet, which is a neighboring community that has almost 40 wells. So they're
looking at Lake Water.
Right, but their circumstances are different in that area.
She addressed a little bit of my concerns as far as, I've been here since 2013, and it seems like every month it's one thing or another. It's like, oh, well, my water's doing this or not. And then we're on our own. If anything goes wrong, it's all on us. So therefore, although we do have control, we also burden the responsibility of it. That's what scares me a little bit. I'm in real estate, so when I'm looking at investment properties or whatnot, that's one of the risk, right? So yeah, I want to control it, but what is the risk, and is that worth it? And that's where I guess I'm coming a little bit from is we have the maintenance issues. We constantly are being told, oh, it's just this, it's just this. It's one thing after another, and that just seems to nickel and dime us. So it's not nickels and dimes. It's $100,000. It's $1 million. It's $3 million for your well. And is that worth standing on our own? And every other community does seem to have gone the other route.
Sure. So, the one thing we need to take into perspective here is, when you look at the overall age of these wells and the use from, yes, we've had to use well number 1 in the past 3 years on 2 significant scenarios, but outside of that, we've almost never had to use it.
Then why do we continue?
Yes, we've had two problems with the well, and those are unfortunately in a very close time frame of a snapshot. But you look at the lifespan of all of our wells. Well number 1 has been going to distribution very sparingly. It most likely would continue to be very sparingly used to distribution. It's just unfortunate timing, if you want to call it that in the span of 3 years we've had 2 incidents. But there's been very, very little incidents outside of that. We've never had any sort of other major well problems outside of these two time frames. I think maybe a little bit. I think it's maybe a little bit exacerbated because, we're coming out of a major reconstruction project where, we did make a major change, and I think that's one of the issues why people are conflating, the well number 1 problem with the RO plant. It's because you're just coming out of construction, and then you have these issues that would cause us to use well number 1. But there really is no connection to those directly. Well number 1 is not going through the plant. Well number 1 doesn't have any operations on the plant. It's just that we had some issues with well number 3. One was a mechanical issue back in 2015, and this other one this year was truly an accident that occurred on site. It was not necessarily. What was that?
How long ago was that? You said this year happened?
That was the incident that happened over Easter in the past couple months.
All right, because we continue, just like 2 days ago, I filled my pool with orange water. Where represent them.
Well, and that's what I was talking about before. Of because we had to use well number 1, we weren't able to do hydrant flushing this year. That's part of our regular maintenance, and then we would have to do that regardless. So we weren't able to do that to kind of flush out some of that sediment.
I think I missed that. I
Yeah.
just as we're talking.
I think one of the primary impediments to going to lake water was the loss of water that we have, and we're losing about 40% rough numbers.
Correct.
The average usage is 1.4 million a day, and we just found some 400,000 in the, if I'm not mistaken, a leak around 400,000.
Correct.
That was just found.
That was multiple leaks.
That was last year.
And that
it was
was
part.
last
It was
year.
part of last year. We found about 24 leaks or so last year.
So were we at 60% loss and now we're at 40, or were we at 40 and now we're at?
Again, it's a hard number to exactly pinpoint because there's a lot of estimations that go into that LMO2 form. For example, when we do have water main breaks, once we expose the pipe and dig it up, we don't know exactly how big the hole in that pipe was or how long it was running for. It could run sometimes for 12 to 14 hours before it surfaces. So when we do our forms, we have to do a lot of estimation. Hey, was that a 2-inch hole that ran for 4 hours, for 2 hours, for 8 hours? So it's a really wide-ranging number. We kind of estimate our water loss somewhere between 30 and 40%.
So Matt, is that based on pump versus build, or what?
There's a lot of factors that kind of go into that. The LMO2 form has a bunch of stuff in there. It does have pump versus build, but it also takes into account, it tries to calculate hydrant flushing, water main breaks, other sorts of uses. And then there is a calculation component that says based on the age and size of each pipe and the mileage, you would expect this volume of loss anyways. So unfortunately, it's not a hard number you can hang your hat on. There's a lot of estimation that goes into that.
Did I read with the new fees that they're charging that there's a scheduled maintenance that's anticipated?
For the wells?
Yeah, and will number 1 be back in?
Yeah, so all the wells do have a scheduled maintenance process. Those are not tied into any fee structure per se. Typically, you want to pull your well and do maintenance on it approximately every 10 to 15 years, which is kind of the cycle we've been working on. We've done maintenance actually on most of our wells. Well number 4 was done right around 2011 prior to the plant construction. Well number 3 we did in 15 when we had to issue. So that well was actually scheduled for regular maintenance later that fall, but we had that mechanical issue that had popped up in the end of August, and we had to accelerate that maintenance a few months forward because that issue popped up. And then well number 1 we actually did maintenance on 24 months ago.
Well number 1?
Because we actually replaced the pump on it.
That was significant.
I don't remember. That was fairly recently as well.
It was more than 2 years ago.
7 years before we do any scheduled maintenance.
We would be looking probably at right around 2020 to be re-looking at well number 4. Yes. So if there's no other questions, we'll kind of close it out tonight. I do have my business card at the back of the room. So if you have any questions that pop up afterwards, feel free. Shoot me an email, give me a call. Aaron and I will both be happy to talk with you and answer any further questions. But thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.